Hi all, this is Professor Glassheim. I'm going to give a very short lecture on Czech nationalism here online. This is a little bit of an experiment, so do let me know how it goes. So, we've already met František Palacký, author of the Slavic Manifesto that we read a few weeks ago. He was known among Czechs as the father of the Czech nation. And I want to use the example of Palacký and the Czech national movement to describe a third kind of nationalism in Europe, which we can call autonomous nationalism. Czechs made up about 2/3 of the population of the Habsburg provinces of Bohemia and Moravia. Most Czech speakers were peasants, but there was a small and growing middle class emerging in the early 19th century. Early Czech nationalists were influenced by both liberal ideas from the French Revolution and the cultural nationalism of Herder. For these Czechs, Habsburg rule was increasingly stifling. It was German-dominated. The German language dominated the bureaucracy. There was censorship, the lack of a parliament, representative institutions. So the great Czech historian and later politician, Palacký, rallied Czechs around a program of cultural nationalism. And this program had two basic tenets drawn from Herder. First of all, even nations without a state have a history. And second of all nations have a right to develop freely, using their own language and celebrating their own unique culture. And Herder had, in his ideas for the philosophy of history, in fact, written very encouragingly about the Slavic nations, arguing that they were peace-loving and that they had a great past and a promising future. Well, Palacký wasn't just a theorist at all. He was actually quite an activist, and he became the central figure in what would soon be known as the Czech National Revival. And the idea was that this group of scholars and patriots were reviving the Czech language and culture, which had fallen into decay after they had been absorbed by the Habsburgs, and in particular after the 30 Years' War, when Czech sovereignty was once again extinguished. So first of all, Palacký set out to write a history of the Czech nation. He buried himself in archives. He traveled all over Europe in search of manuscripts related to medieval Czech history. He ended up writing a monumental 6-volume history of the Czechs during the glory days of the Czech kingdom, in particular focusing on the 15th and 16th centuries. So actually from around the time of Jan Hus for another century or so after that, the Czechs had substantial independence, and this was seen as a great period in Czech history. So Palacky's history had two central arguments. First of all, that Czech history was defined by centuries of struggle and coexistence with Germans. And then second of all, that Czechs, though now they were a subject people in a German-dominated empire, the Habsburg Empire, they had a glorious past, and that this needed to be recovered and remembered and celebrated. So, drawing on Herder, Palacký argued that Czechs had a national character, that they were peace-loving, democratic, and egalitarian at heart, and he opposed this to the German character, which he depicted as warlike, authoritarian, and selfish. And this was an age where people very much had these kind of stereotypes attached to different ethnic groups. And so, just for example, Italians were fun-loving and lively, and basically products of the southern climate, and the Germans were much more northern and serious, but also authoritarian. Palecký's second project, along with a whole bunch of other Czech scholars, was to modernize the Czech language. Since Czechs had, until quite recently, been primarily uneducated peasants, the Czech language lacked a modern scientific, philosophical, and commercial vocabulary. In effect, the Enlightenment had not taken place within the Czech language, and so Palecký and others, they sought to bring this modernization of language to the Czechs. So they invented thousands of words, and they standardized written Czech, and this prepared the way for Czechs to take part in broader European trends in culture, science, and commerce. So for the Czechs, early nationalism took the form of a cultural revival. Now, only in 1848, the springtime of peoples, did this cultural movement take a political form. So you remember the Prague-Slog Congress and the also riots in the summer of 1848. And even though the Czech Revolution, Czech part in the revolution, didn't yield any great changes in the situation of the Czechs, nonetheless, from then on, Czechs sought increasing autonomy, really largely cultural autonomy, within the Habsburg Empire. By the late 19th century, more and more Czechs were imagining their own national state on the model of the French and the Germans, though a much smaller state, really encompassing Bohemia and Moravia, and perhaps also Slovakia, which was at that time part of the Hungarian kingdom. Well, with the Habsburgs weakened by World War I, the Czechs declared their independence and founded the new state of Czechoslovakia in 1918. So what began as cultural nationalism became political nationalism and eventually separatism. And this was a pattern followed by many East Central European peoples. These included Serbs, Croats, Hungarians, Romanians, and others. But that last stage really is a subject for the future of the course. We'll be covering that in a few weeks when we get to the World War I and the aftermath of empire. So that's it for our mini lecture on Czech nationalism. Do let me know how this went. Thanks.